The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and lavender hand sanitizer, an odd attempt at calm in a building that ran on panic and quarterly forecasts. I'd been in rooms like this for 19 years. I'd sat through mergers, product pivots, alignment sessions, and those grim Friday meetings where someone's calendar invite had an unusually polite subject line. I knew the choreography, the too bright smile from HR, the manager's hands folded like prayer, the empty chair position so you couldn't quite reach the door without walking past the people ending your paycheck. Still, when I walked in and saw Sloane Harrow seated across from me, my chest went quiet. Not tight. Not racing. Quiet like a machine idling before the load hits. Sloane was Senior Director of Platform Strategy, a title that meant she could ruin your week without ever writing a line of code. She wore the same slate blazer she wore whenever she wanted to look human. To her right sat a man I'd never seen before, tall, crisp, and laminated in that way HR people sometimes are, like they've been sealed against empathy. Rowan, Sloane said, and my name sounded like a form she'd already signed. I didn't correct her. I didn't smile. I just took the chair. Thank you for coming on short notice, the HR man added. I'm Kent, Human Capital Partner. Human Capital. I watched the words hang between us like something dead. Sloane clasped her hands. We're restructuring your role. There was the opening line of corporate grief. The polite cough before the execution. I nodded slowly as if I were considering an architecture diagram and not the shape of my life. My voice, when it arrived, surprised even me with how steady it sounded. Okay. Sloane's expression flickered, something like relief. She had expected a scene. They always did, especially from someone my age. 56 isn't ancient, but in tech it's treated like a defect that might spread if you talk about it too loudly. Kent slid a manila folder across the table. The classic prop. The official paper version of a decision made weeks ago. The company is moving in a new direction, he said. We're consolidating the applied systems group under product engineering. I accepted the folder and didn't open it. I could already recite its contents with the accuracy of a prayer. 2 weeks severance for every year of service. 3 months of COBRA coverage. A list of career transition resources. A reminder of my obligations. A signature line waiting like a trap. Sloane leaned forward with a controlled softness. Your contributions have been valuable. She paused, choosing the least offensive knife. We need to build for speed now. For the next generation. The next generation. Like I was an operating system they couldn't update. Understood, I said. Kent glanced at Sloane. Their eyes touched briefly, a silent exchange that said she's taking it. Great. We can be done early. We'd like you to clean out your desk by end of day Friday, Sloane continued. IT will coordinate the return of your badge, laptop, and phone. Pi team? I asked. Sloane exhaled, almost grateful I'd asked something procedural. They'll be notified this afternoon. My team. 6 engineers I had recruited out of lab basements, defense contractors, and one exhausted startup in Austin that chewed through people like a shredder. I'd built them carefully, like a delicate machine. Diverse minds, patient temperaments, skill and curiosity balanced with the stubborn refusal to ship something fragile. Together we had built the thing that made Astorvale profitable. Astorvale was not a household name, but half the companies you had heard of used its compliance platform Ledgerlight to keep their financial reporting from collapsing under its own weight. Our back-end engine was the reason it didn't buckle. The reason the platform could reconcile millions of entries without choking. The reason competitors had never caught up. I was not supposed to say that part out loud. So I didn't. Instead I stood, folder still unopened in my hand, and made my face into something neutral. Is there anything else? They looked almost offended by my composure. Sloane recovered first. No. Thank you for being professional. Professional. Like emotion was a policy violation. I walked back through the corridor of glass offices, past the wall of marketing posters that praised innovation, past the break room where someone had left a tray of cupcakes for a product launch I hadn't been invited to speak at. My heels clicked softly on polished concrete, the sound oddly intimate, like my body reminding the building it was still here. Outside the executive suite, the long aquarium of a meeting room glowed with a projected deck. I couldn't help myself. I slowed. Inside, their faces floated behind glass. The CFO with his permanent fatigue, the head of product with his white sneakers and confidence, and at the center RCO Lucian Keen, standing like a preacher in front of a chart. I couldn't see the numbers, but I could read the title. Q4 Revenue Acceleration. Scaling Ledger Light. Lucian's hand cut through the air in a clean, practiced gesture. The same hand that had patted my shoulder at last year's industry summit. He had called the engine our breakthrough, and introduced me as one of the incredible minds in research, as if I were a collective noun. I watched him smile into the room as though he'd invented gravity. Then I continued on because letting myself stay even 5 seconds longer felt like granting them the pleasure of being witnessed. My office was 2 floors down, tucked at the end of the applied systems wing. They called it an innovation corridor. It had no windows. I closed the door, set the folder on my desk, and finally let myself breathe. On the wall was a framed photo from 10 years ago. Me younger in a hoodie standing beside the first cluster we'd built out of salvaged servers. My hair had been darker then. My eyes had been less careful. The caption in silver ink read, "To Rowan, for making the impossible boring." That's what the best engineering does. Makes miracles look like Tuesday. I opened my bottom drawer and pulled out my personal phone. Not the company-issued one with the management profile. Not the one that could be wiped by a bored IT technician with an attitude. My phone. My data. My little island. I typed a single message. It's happening. Friday is my last day. The reply came so fast it buzzed before I lowered the phone. Perfect. Contracts are ready. Dinner tonight? Same place. Backroom. I stared at the words for a beat, then felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph. Not even relief. Clarity. I stood and walked to the whiteboard where I'd been sketching throughput patterns for weeks. There, half erased in the corner, was a note I'd written to myself after a strange email thread had landed in my inbox last month. An internal legal chain forwarded to me by mistake, the subject line bland and deadly. Patent filing status. Engine architecture/inventor attribution. I remembered how my stomach had dipped when I read it. Not because I didn't understand the process. I understood it intimately. I had sat through enough internal trainings to know the ritual phrases: work for hire, scope of employment, company resources. The corporate catechism. But I also knew what they did when they wanted a story to look clean. They made the inventor disappear. I turned from the board and looked at my desk. Neat, controlled, exactly as I liked it. A place where I'd built something that made other people rich while I collected polite compliments and slightly larger workloads. And I thought about what Sloan had said, the next generation. I smiled not because it was funny but because it finally had a shape. Okay, I said again to no one. Then I picked up the folder and slid it into my bag unopened. Let them think I was leaving empty-handed. That was the point. Because what I was taking with me wasn't a laptop or a file or a trade secret on a thumb drive. What I was taking was something much harder to retrieve. My name. By the time I left the building, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the glass facade of Astorvale into a mirror. I caught my reflection as the doors slid shut behind me. Tailored jacket, deliberate posture. A woman who looked like she still belonged. That mattered. Not to them. To me. I walked 2 blocks before I let my shoulders fall. San Mateo always smelled faintly of eucalyptus and money, a combination that made ambition feel wholesome. I'd moved here 20 years ago with 2 suitcases, a folding bike, and a naive belief that if you built something extraordinary people would notice who built it. I knew better now. The restaurant was called Arashur, an understated Japanese place tucked behind a nondescript office complex near the waterfront. No sign out front. No tourists. The kind of place you went when you didn't want to be seen having important conversations. I arrived early. Old habit. Engineers show up before the meeting starts so they can see what the room looks like when it's empty. The hostess led me to the back alcove, shielded by wooden screens etched with abstract waves. I set my bag down, folded my coat over the chair and ordered green tea. My hands were steady. That surprised me. When Calderwin arrived, the temperature of the room seemed to shift. Calder didn't rush. He never did. Mid-40s, silver threading through black hair he refused to dye, he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged in any room. As CEO of Heliox Systems, Astorvale's most dangerous competitor, he had learned the value of silence. They really did it, he said, sliding into the seat across from me. After everything. I nodded. Restructured. He let out a breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. Lucian never understood what you built. He understood slides. He understood demos. He understood applause. The waiter arrived. Calder ordered without looking at the menu. I smiled at that. Another detail that told you everything about a person. They always do, I said once we were alone again. They understand the surface, not the load-bearing parts. Calder leaned back. When you texted me last month, I thought you were being cautious. Now I see you were being precise. A month ago, that was when the unease had sharpened into certainty. The misdirected email hadn't been dramatic. No villainous language. No explicit plan to erase me. Just a thread between legal and product leadership discussing timing and attribution, the way people discuss furniture delivery. I'd read it 3 times before closing my laptop. Then I'd opened a notebook I kept at home, paper not digital, and started writing dates. Because I knew the rules. Better than they thought. Intellectual property developed within the scope of employment, using company resources, during company time belonged to the company. That clause had been waved at me so many times it felt like background noise. But there were edges. There were boundaries. And there were things I had been doing quietly, carefully after hours. Refinements. Not tweaks. Not optimizations you could argue were derivative. Architectural shifts. I'd seen them months earlier, late one night at my kitchen table in Redwood City, when a throughput bottleneck refused to resolve itself. I'd closed my work laptop, opened my personal one, and started again from first principles. No Jira tickets. No Slack messages. No company VPN. Just me, a legal pad, and a question no one at Astorvale had bothered to ask. What if the engine didn't scale by force, but by absence? The idea had taken hold like a burr. I'd spent weekends on it. Early mornings. Evenings when the house was quiet and the only sound was the soft whir of my old standing fan. I documented everything. Dates. Times. Hardware serial numbers. Git repositories created under my personal account. Commits time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., 6:12 a.m., Sundays, holidays. Not because I planned to leave. Because something in my gut told me they were planning to forget me. Calder reached into his jacket and slid a slim folder across the table. I didn't bring this tonight to pressure you, he said. You decide when you're ready. Or if. I didn't open it yet. I met his eyes instead. You know I won't burn them down, I said. I know, he replied. That's why I trust you. That was the difference. Trust, not control. The waiter returned with our food. For a few minutes we ate in silence. I let the miso warm my hands, let the day settle into something manageable. They tried to file, I said finally. The original engine. They stalled. Legal said it was an oversight. Calder's expression hardened. Oversights don't usually come with strategy memos. I smiled thinly. You'd be amazed what people put in writing when they assume you're invisible. He nodded. And the new work? I took a sip of tea. Filed. Granted. Faster than expected. That got his attention. Under your name? Wine alone. He leaned forward now. Then they're exposed. Yes, I said. But not because I want revenge. I know, he said again, softer this time. I thought of Sloane's face. Of Kent's laminated calm. Of Lucian's hand slicing the air in front of a revenue chart built on my ideas. They made a calculation, I said. They assumed the value lived in the company. Not in the person. Calder nodded slowly. Companies make that mistake all the time. Then they deserve the lesson, I said. Not bitter. Not angry. Just factual. He slid the folder closer. Heliox would like exclusive licensing rights. We'd announce you as chief systems architect. Publicly. Fully. I opened the folder then. I read every word. Not because I doubted him, but because this was how you honored work. By paying attention. When I looked up, I felt something loosen in my chest. I'll sign, I said. But there's a condition. Name it. My team, I said. All of them. They don't know yet. They shouldn't pay for decisions they didn't make. Calder didn't hesitate. We have roles ready. Better ones. I nodded once. We toasted, not loudly, not dramatically. Just the soft click of glass in a room designed for discretion. When I left Ayrshire that night, the air had cooled. I walked to my car slowly, phone in hand. A notification blinked across the screen. Internal announcement. Organizational update. Applied systems. They were telling my team. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, watching the lights of the city reflect on the windshield. Friday was coming. And after that, Monday. Thursday arrived wrapped in artificial sympathy. By the time I stepped into the office, the news had spread. Not officially. Astorvale preferred to drip-feed bad news through alignment conversations. But engineers have their own information channels. A pause too long on a manager's calendar. A Slack message that starts with "Hey, got a minute?" A sudden meeting that includes HR but pretends not to. People looked at me differently now. Not with fear. With confusion. I passed Maribel from QA near the elevators. She hesitated, then touched my arm lightly. "I'm so sorry," she said. "This doesn't make sense." "No," I replied. "It doesn't." That was the truth that hurt the most. If I'd been failing, if I'd missed deadlines or lost relevance, I could have built a story around it. Humans need narratives. But this was subtraction disguised as progress. My team's room was unusually quiet when I walked in. 6 pairs of eyes lifted from monitors in near-perfect unison. Miguel spoke first. He always did. "We heard." I nodded. "I figured you would." No one moved. No one reached for a keyboard. The room felt suspended, like a held breath. "They say it's restructuring," said Anya, her voice tight. "But they reassigned half our roadmap to product engineering." I leaned against the conference table. "They're folding the group." "Why you?" Miguel asked. Not angry. Genuinely puzzled. I considered lying. I considered giving them something palatable. That I told the truth. "Because I'm expensive," I said. "Because I don't fit the story they want to tell investors. Because I ask questions that don't fit neatly on slides." No one argued. "They'll try to keep the engine," I continued. "They'll act like it's separate from the people who built it." Miguel's jaw tightened. "That's not possible." "It's common," I said. "Which doesn't make it smart." I looked at their faces. Engineers, problem solvers, people who had trusted me with their careers. "I won't ask you to do anything disloyal," I said. "Finish the week. Document what you're asked to document. Be professional." "And then?" Anya asked. "And then," I said carefully, "you check your personal email on Monday morning." Something shifted in the room. Not hope exactly, but alignment. The kind that comes when intelligent people sense a pattern forming. After that, the day became a parade of exits. Knowledge transfer meetings with people half my age who didn't yet know what questions to ask. Polite nods. Careful phrasing. Me explaining systems that had taken years to internalize to managers who believed understanding was optional. I documented everything. Not out of generosity. Out of strategy. Every architecture decision. Every trade-off. Every risk I'd flagged and been told to park. I wrote like someone who expected to be questioned later. By lawyers, by boards, by history. At lunch, I ate alone at my desk. Someone had left a company-branded notebook on my chair with a sticky note. "Thank you for everything." No signature. I slipped it into my bag. Friday came faster than it should have. My exit interview with HR was scheduled for 3 p.m. Denise sat across from me this time. She had replaced Kent at some point, though the tone was identical. Same checklist. Same voice trained to flatten human moments into compliance. "You understand," she said, "that any intellectual property developed during your employment remains the property of Astorvale." "Yes," I replied pleasantly. "Anything developed within the scope of my employment, using company resources during company time." She nodded, already checking the box. "And you affirm that you have not retained any proprietary information." "I have taken nothing that belongs to Astorvale," I said. "Also true." She slid the NDA across the table. I signed it without hesitation. Fear lives in uncertainty, not in preparation. When I returned to my office for the last time, Sloane was waiting in the doorway. "I just wanted to make sure everything's clear," she said, watching me place books into a cardboard box. "Crystal," I replied. She leaned against the frame, lowering her voice. "You know this wasn't personal." I met her eyes. "It never is." He smiled, relieved. "Are you taking time off?" she asked. "To reset." I taped the box shut. No. I start a new role on Monday. Her smile faltered. Already? Yes. What kind of role? A leadership one, I said. With engineering. She nodded slowly as if filing it under irrelevant details. Well, she said, straightening. Good luck, Rowan. Thank you, I replied. As I walked out of the building for the last time, badge surrendered, box in my arms, I stopped just outside the doors. From the street, I could see the executive floor lit up again. Another late meeting. Another discussion about optimization and velocity and how to do more with less. They thought they had reduced a cost. They had no idea they'd removed a foundation. That night I slept deeply. Monday would be loud. Monday morning arrived clean and unapologetic. I woke before my alarm the way I always had on days that mattered. The house was still dark, Redwood City quiet in that brief hour before ambition woke up and started checking its phone. I stood at the kitchen counter, coffee warming my hands, and watched the sky thin from black to blue. For the first time in years I wasn't bracing myself for a day at Astorvale. That absence felt strange. Not empty, lighter. At 7 a.m. precisely my phone buzzed. Press release is live. Heliox Legal and Comms are monitoring reactions. Calder. I didn't open it yet. I already knew what it would say. We'd reviewed every word until it carried the right weight without sounding vindictive. I dressed carefully. Not dramatically. No statement colors. A charcoal suit, soft lines, nothing that begged to be remembered for the wrong reasons. The kind of outfit that said I belong wherever I'm standing. The car arrived at 7:30. Heliox's headquarters sat north of Palo Alto, all glass and oak and quiet confidence. No motivational posters. No slogans etched into the walls. Just space and light and people who looked up when you entered a room. Calder met me in the lobby, coffee already in hand. Good timing, he said. Industry feeds are picking it up faster than we expected. I smiled. They always do when a story contradicts the narrative. My new office was on the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A real desk. Whiteboards that hadn't yet been claimed by anyone else's half-finished thinking. As I set my bag down, my phone lit up again. Ron, what did you do? Miguel. I laughed quietly and typed back. Check your personal email. All of you. Then I opened the press release. Heliox Systems acquires exclusive rights to breakthrough distributed processing architecture. Welcomes creator Rowan Hale as chief systems architect. Creator. Not team member. Not contributor. Not part of the journey. Creator. The release laid it out cleanly. My background. My role as sole inventor. The patent number. The performance gains. And then, almost casually, the line that mattered most. Organizations currently utilizing the architecture will require licensing agreements moving forward. At 9:12 a.m. my phone rang. Lucian Keene. I didn't answer. At 9:14 a text. There's been a misunderstanding. Please call me. I forwarded it to Heliox Legal. At 9:17 another call. Then another. By 9:30 the first internal message arrived from my former team. Total chaos here. Legal is pulling files. Lucian looks not great. I could picture it perfectly. The sudden realization that the engine wasn't an abstract asset. That it had a name. Patent. A future that no longer included them. At 10 a.m. Calder stepped into my office, leaning casually against the doorframe. Astorvale's stock is down 6%, he said. Ours is up 11%. That was fast, I said. Markets hate uncertainty, he replied. And they hate discovering they've been wrong even more. Another message from Miguel. They're wheeling servers into conference rooms. Forensic review. Someone asked if they could recreate your work in 6 months. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. The original architecture had taken me nearly 3 years. Years of false starts, late nights, and one particularly memorable Thanksgiving spent rewriting a scheduler because I couldn't stand the thought of shipping something brittle. 6 months. That's what people say when they've never built anything foundational. At 11:45 an email arrived from Lucian. Rowan, we value your contributions and would like to discuss options. Surely this can be resolved amicably. Resolved. As if this were a scheduling conflict, not a reckoning. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked down the hall to my first meeting at Heliox. The engineering team was already gathered. Attentive, curious, prepared. When I spoke, no one interrupted. No one paraphrased my ideas 5 minutes later as if they'd just occurred to them. They asked real questions. They listened. At noon my phone buzzed again. We accept. All of us. When do we start? Miguel. I typed back. Tuesday morning. Welcome home. Somewhere 8 miles south, Astorvale's executive conference room had stopped being a place of confidence and become a room where people searched for someone to blame. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something steadier. Validation. Not because they were failing, but because the truth was finally louder than the narrative. And the truth, once released, has a way of accelerating. By Tuesday the story had outgrown me. That's how you know something real has happened, when it stops being about a single person and starts forcing institutions to explain themselves. I arrived early again, not out of nerves this time but habit. The building hummed softly, alive in a way Astorvale never had been. Engineers drifted in with coffee and conversations already mid-thought. No one looked over their shoulder before speaking. No one waited for permission to be curious. At 8:47 a.m. Miguel and the rest of my former team walked through the doors. They didn't look relieved. They looked focused. That mattered more. We didn't celebrate. We didn't trade war stories. We got to work. The first thing I did was erase the whiteboard in the main conference room. Not because what was there was wrong, but because this was a reset. A clean surface carries a kind of respect. It says, what we build here matters enough to start fresh. I began with context, not code. This architecture, I said, was never just about speed. It was about resilience. About systems that don't collapse when assumptions fail. They nodded. They knew this. They'd lived it. What I didn't share before, I continued, were the second-order designs. The ones I kept separate once I realized alignment was no longer mutual. No one asked why. They didn't need to. We mapped the next phase slowly, thoughtfully. Every idea questioned, every shortcut challenged. This was how serious work felt when no one was rushing to look impressive. At 10:30, Calder stepped in briefly. Astorvale's board has called an emergency session, he said. Lucian's position is tenuous. I acknowledged it without comment. At 11:15, Heliox Legal forwarded me a message. Astorvale intends to challenge the patent. Claims derivative work. I read it once. Then again. Then I forwarded it back with a single line. Documentation attached. Years of timestamps. Hardware logs. Repository histories. Witness attestations from independent collaborators. A narrative so clean it left no room for interpretation. Preparation looks boring until it saves you. At noon, Denise called. Her voice was different now. Careful in a new way. Rowan, she began, we believe there may have been a misunderstanding regarding ownership rights. I don't, I replied calmly. She hesitated. Victor was hoping you might come in. Just to talk. That wouldn't be appropriate, I said. Any discussions should go through Heliox's legal counsel. Silence. I'll pass that along, she said finally. That afternoon, industry newsletters lit up. Not gossip blogs. Not opinion pieces. Analysts. They asked the question investors hate most. How did Astorvale fail to secure the intellectual property behind its core platform? By 3 p.m. their stock had dropped another 9%. By 4:30, 3 clients had contacted Heliox about contingency planning. At 5 o'clock, Miguel forwarded me a message from inside the building I no longer occupied. All hands was brutal. Lucian tried to project confidence. No one bought it. Someone asked if they'd pushed out the inventor before filing the patent. He shut it down fast. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. This wasn't satisfaction. This was consequence. There's a difference. Wednesday morning the headline changed. Astorvale CEO Lucian Keen steps down amid patent crisis. By lunchtime Sloan was gone. So was the head of legal. The board issued a statement about strategic oversight and renewed commitment to innovation integrity. Words come easily when the damage is already done. That evening I stood alone in my office, city lights spreading beneath the windows like a network diagram. Connections, dependencies, paths forward. Calder appeared beside me with 2 glasses. The board wanted me to tell you, he said, handing me one. They consider this your first major win. I took the glass but didn't drink. It's not a win, I said. It's a correction. He smiled. Those are the ones that last. As I finally took a sip, my phone buzzed with a final update from Miguel. Interim CEO sent an email. Wants to rebuild trust. Feels late. It was late. But not pointless. Because systems can change, if the cost of not changing becomes high enough. And somewhere between their panic and our progress, the industry was learning something it should have known all along. Innovation doesn't belong to buildings. It belongs to people. And people, when ignored, eventually take their work with them. The first time I felt the full weight of what had changed was not in a boardroom or a headline. It was in a meeting. A real one. Thursday morning, Heliox's senior architecture review. No slide deck. No executive summary reduced to 3 bullets and a slogan. Just a room full of people who knew enough to be dangerous and cared enough to ask better questions. I stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, explaining a failure mode most companies never planned for. The moment when scale doesn't break your system all at once, but erodes it quietly, transaction by transaction, until trust collapses before performance does. No one interrupted. No one glanced at their phone. When I finished, there was a pause. Then one of the younger engineers, Devon, brilliant and unafraid, said, "I've never heard anyone frame it that way. That changes how we test everything." That sentence landed harder than any applause. That was recognition. Not credit in a press release. Not a title. But the visible shift of understanding from one mind to another. Later that day, Calder forwarded me an email. It was from Richard Bloom, Astervale's newly appointed interim CEO. The tone was different from Lucian's. Measured. Direct. Respectful. "Dr. Hale, I've been brought in to stabilize the company during a difficult transition. I'd like to discuss a fair licensing agreement for your patented architecture. We're prepared to formally acknowledge your role as inventor and address prior oversights." I read it twice. Not because I doubted his sincerity, but because I recognized the moment. This was the point where ego had finally left the room. I forwarded the email to legal with a short note. Phase 1 complete. Their reply came back within minutes. "We're ready." By Friday, the fallout had become structural. Astervale's valuation had dropped nearly 25% since Monday. Analysts stopped speculating and started modeling worst-case scenarios. Recruiters quietly reached out to Heliox engineers, not the other way around. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. I started getting messages. Not from executives. From women. Senior engineers. Architects. Technical leads. Women in their 40s and 50s who had spent decades building systems other people explained. "I thought I was invisible until this happened to you. Your story made me pull my old notebooks out of storage. I finally filed my own provisional patent last night. I answered every one of them. Not with advice. With validation. You're not late," I wrote again and again. "You're right on time." The licensing negotiations took less time than I'd expected. Astervale had 2 options. Rebuild Ledgerlight from scratch without touching anything covered by my patent, or license the architecture at a rate that would hurt, but not kill, them. They chose pain over extinction. The final terms included something Calder had predicted they would resist more than the cost. Public attribution. My name. The press release went out on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Astervale announces strategic licensing agreement with Heliox Systems. Acknowledges Rowan Hale as original architect of distributed processing engine. No spin. No euphemisms. Just fact. That night, I sat on my back porch, a glass of wine untouched beside me, listening to the low hum of traffic in the distance. I thought about the version of myself from a decade earlier. The one who believed that if she just worked harder, recognition would eventually arrive on its own. It doesn't. Recognition has to be claimed, protected, and sometimes forced into the open. The next morning, I stood on a stage in Chicago at the National Systems Engineering Summit. The organizer introduced me without qualifiers. Creator. Architect. Leader. As I stepped up to the podium, I scanned the audience. Rows of faces. Curious. Kind of. Last year, I'd sat near the back while Lucian spoke about our innovation pipeline. This year I was the pipeline. I spoke about architecture, yes, but also about ownership. About documentation. About why ideas don't float freely through companies like shared air, but move through bodies, minds, and hands. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was sustained. Afterward, a young engineer approached me. She couldn't have been more than 27. I didn't know we were allowed to care who gets credit, she said quietly. I smiled at her. We always were, I replied. We were just taught not to. That was when I understood the final shape of what had happened. This was never about proving Astorvale wrong. It was about proving something else right. That innovation, when properly valued, doesn't just survive. It multiplies. And industries that forget that lesson are condemned to relearn it, expensively. Success has a way of distorting memory. By the time autumn settled in, people spoke about the Astorvale situation as if it had been inevitable, a case study with clean edges and obvious mistakes. They talked about it the way analysts talk about past crashes. Confident, detached, certain they would have seen it coming. They wouldn't have. Because from the inside, collapse never announces itself. It arrives as convenience, as silence, as the quiet removal of people who complicate the story. 3 months after my departure, Heliox felt different. Not just larger, stronger. Under my leadership, the systems group stopped chasing marginal gains and started rethinking foundations. We shipped 2 major updates ahead of schedule, not because we moved faster but because we broke less. Clients noticed. Engineers noticed. Competitors noticed. And Astorvale? They stabilized. Barely. The licensing fees cut deep. So did the reputational damage. Their new leadership implemented sweeping reforms. New IP review processes, mandatory inventor attribution, independent patent audits. All things I had suggested years earlier and been told were premature. Premature is often another word for inconvenient. One afternoon, Calder forwarded me an internal industry memo circulating among board members across the valley. Lesson learned. Innovation risk is people risk. I sat with that for a long time. Because it was almost right. The real lesson was harder. Innovation risk is ego risk. Astorvale hadn't failed because they lacked talent. They failed because they believed talent was interchangeable. That if one person left, another could be slotted in like a component with identical tolerances. That belief is comforting. It's also wrong. Late in October, I received an invitation in a cream-colored envelope. Heavy paper, intentional weight. Women in Technology Leadership Summit. Keynote. Owning your intellectual value. I almost declined. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because visibility comes with a cost. Once you become a symbol, people stop seeing the work and start seeing the narrative. But then I thought of the messages. The emails. The young engineer in Chicago. So I accepted. The summit was held in Santa Fe of all places. Not Silicon Valley. Not New York. A deliberate choice, I was told, neutral ground. Standing backstage, microphone clipped to my jacket, I felt a familiar tension. Not fear. Responsibility. When I stepped out, the room quieted. I didn't tell my story chronologically. I didn't name names. I talked about systems. About how companies meticulously protect physical assets while leaving intellectual ones vague and undocumented. About how credit flows upward by default unless deliberately redirected. About how women, and especially older women, are encouraged to disappear quietly when their work becomes too foundational to ignore. Innovation isn't anonymous, I said. It never has been. Treating it that way isn't efficiency. It's erasure. I watched heads nod. Pens move faster. Afterward, the conversations were intense, urgent. People didn't ask how I'd won. They asked how they could protect themselves without burning bridges. That question stayed with me. Because the answer wasn't litigation. Or leverage. Or perfectly timed exits. The answer was visibility. Documentation. Attribution. Building systems where recognition was routine, not corrective. That night, back in my hotel room, I checked my phone one last time. An alert flashed across the screen. Heliox Systems surpasses Astorvale in market valuation. I set the phone down. Not triumph. Closure. Because what mattered wasn't who was bigger. It was who had learned. And whether the industry would remember the lesson long enough for it to matter. The next morning, as the sun rose over the desert, I knew the story still had one chapter left. Not about them. About me. And what comes after being seen. 1 year to the day after I was asked to clean out my desk, I arrived at my office before sunrise. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to remember. The building was quiet, Heliox still asleep in that rare, suspended moment before calendars filled and systems spun up. I set my bag down, walked to the window and looked out over the city. Roads, lights, movement beginning again. Networks waking up. I thought about how many times I'd stood in buildings like this over the years, believing I was temporary in places built to last. I had that backward. The quarterly innovation report lay open on my desk. Under my leadership, Heliox had launched 3 major products, each built on the architecture I once sketched alone at my kitchen table. Market share had shifted. Competitors had adjusted. The industry had quietly recalibrated. A knock sounded at the door. Calder stepped in, holding a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "Happy anniversary," he said, setting them down. "The board asked me to tell you personally." I raised an eyebrow. "We officially passed Astorvale in market valuation this morning. First time in company history." I smiled, not broadly, not triumphantly. Just enough. "That's what happens," I said, "when you stop treating innovation like a consumable." We poured the champagne but didn't rush to drink it. My assistant appeared moments later with a sleek envelope. Inside was an invitation. National Conference on Technology and Ethics. Closing keynote. Innovation has a name. Calder chuckled. "You've become something of a reference point." "I didn't set out to be," I said. "No," he agreed. "You set out to do the work." Later that afternoon I took a walk through the engineering floor. Conversations paused, not out of fear but acknowledgement. People looked up not because I outranked them but because they trusted me. That was the difference. Trust isn't granted by titles. It's earned by consistency. That evening I checked the news one last time. Astorvale had finalized its internal reforms. New leadership. New policies. Mandatory inventor attribution. Transparent IP governance. I recognized entire sections lifted, almost word for word, from frameworks I'd built at Heliox and spoken about publicly. I didn't mind. Ideas once protected are meant to spread. A message came in from Miguel. "Hard to believe where we were a year ago. Also, new prototype just cleared stress testing. You need to see this." I smiled. The work continued. And that, I realized, was the real ending. Not revenge. Not victory. Not the fall of people who failed to see. But continuity. I raised my glass alone, not to a company or a title, but to something simpler and harder earned. To being named. To the truth that innovation doesn't emerge from mission statements or buildings or branding decks. It emerges from people who think deeply, work carefully, and refuse to disappear quietly. I didn't win because someone else lost. I won because I stopped letting my work be anonymous. And somewhere, I hoped, a woman older than the room she was sitting in was making a different choice. Documenting, protecting, insisting. Not loudly. Just clearly. Because once your name is attached to what you build, it becomes very hard for anyone to pretend you were never there.